August 1974. The Watergate scandal is, well, it's just completely engulfing Washington.
Oh, yeah, total chaos at that point.
Right. And the president's press secretary issues this statement, trying to address the mounting evidence of this massive cover-up. And he uses 3 specific words that honestly changed the course of political public relations forever.
3 very famous words.
Yeah. He says, mistakes were made. 3 words. But what makes them so brilliant and, just so incredibly frustrating is what is missing from that sentence.
Exactly. There's no I. There's no we.
Right. There's no named culprit at all. All accountability just kind of evaporates into thin air.
It really is the ultimate linguistic disappearing act. Like, a crime is acknowledged, but the criminal is just entirely written out of the script.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are answering one single deceptively simple question, which is, who does the action?
Right. Which sounds easy, but it gets complicated fast.
Oh, definitely. So we're looking at a stack of sources today covering grammar definitions, some wild stylistic debates from the 1900s, and even high-stakes clinical communication guidelines. Our mission here is to completely break down active and passive voice.
And if you are prepping for the TEAS or HESI nursing entrance exams, you really need to consider this mandatory listening.
Oh, for sure, because this concept is heavily tested on those exams. But honestly, even if you are just someone who wants to understand how, politicians or corporations or even algorithms use language to shape reality and shift blame, you're going to want to hear this.
Yeah, the passive voice is so often treated as this dry, dusty rule you learn in middle school and then immediately forget.
Right.
But underneath all that terminology, it's actually this incredibly powerful tool for controlling the narrative.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the basic mechanics. Because to understand why those 3 words mistakes were made are so powerful, we really have to look at what grammatical voice actually is.
Yeah, we have to define it properly first.
And one of the biggest traps people fall into is assuming, that any past tense sentence is just automatically passive voice. But voice and tense are completely different things, right?
They're completely independent, yeah. Voice is strictly the feature of a verb that dictates the relationship between a sentence's subject and the action of that verb.
Okay.
And this framework is ancient, by the way. The Greek grammarian Dionysius Thrax was categorizing verbs by voice around 100 BCE.
Oh, wow. So we've been arguing about this for a while.
Literally thousands of years.
So in active voice, the grammatical subject of the sentence is the one performing the action, the doer.
Exactly.
The source material has this great, really straightforward clinical example. It says, the nurse administered the medication. So the nurse is the subject, and the nurse is also the person physically pushing the plunger on the syringe.
Right. The subject and the agent, the doer, are the exact same entity. That is the fundamental definition of active voice.
Makes sense.
But in passive voice, that entire structure flips. The subject receives the action instead of performing it. So the sentence becomes, the medication was administered by the nurse.
Okay, so the medication, the thing being acted upon, gets promoted to the star of the sentence. It sits right there in that primary subject slot.
Yeah, and because you have to promote the receiver of the action to the subject position, there is actually a hard structural limit on what verbs can even be made passive.
Wait, really? Not all verbs?
No, only transitive verbs can be passivized. Transitive verbs are those action words that take a direct object.
Okay, let me translate that into everyday terms just to make sure I'm getting it. You can throw a ball. Because there's an object receiving the action, you can flip it to passive and say the ball was thrown.
Exactly. That works perfectly.
But you can't sleep a ball. You can't arrive a ball. So you cannot say the ball was slept. Intransitive verbs just don't have the architecture to become passive.
That is the perfect way to test it. If the action cannot be transferred to a receiver, then the passive voice simply cannot exist.
I always think of this whole thing like a movie camera. Like grammatical voice is the director's camera.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so active voice points the lens dead center at the actor throwing the punch, right? John punched the wall. But passive voice pivots the camera to focus entirely on the thing getting punched. The wall was punched by John.
Right, the framing changes.
And sometimes the director decides to pan the camera so far over that the guy throwing the punch is entirely out of the frame. The wall was punched.
Yeah, because the framing dictates what the audience actually cares about. And structurally speaking, to achieve that framing in English, you have to use a very specific mathematical formula.
Mathematical formula, what do you mean?
Well, a true passive sentence must contain a form of the auxiliary verb to be, or sometimes we use the informal to get, like, he got fired.
Oh, right.
So it's that auxiliary verb followed by the past participle of the main verb.
So we are looking for combinations like was administered or is being reviewed or has been diagnosed. The to be verb is really doing the heavy lifting there, combined with that past participle.
Exactly. Finding that auxiliary plus participle combination is really the only reliable structural test for the passive voice.
But, that auxiliary verb to be is exactly why people get so confused. People see the word is or was, and their brain just sets off an alarm. They think, aha, I spotted the passive voice.
Which is a huge misconception.
Yeah, because we use to be all the time in active sentences.
We do. We use it to build progressive tenses. Take the sentence, she is running. Is a form of the verb to be, but running is a present participle. She is actively doing the running right now.
The subject is performing the action.
Right. It is an active sentence. The mere presence of the word is doesn't change that.
And what if I say something descriptive, like she was happy, people see the was, and just assume it's a passive sentence about the past?
Yeah, that happens a lot.
But let's apply the logic. Happy is an adjective. It's not a verb. No one is physically doing the action of happying to her. She's just happy.
Yeah.
So that is not a passive sentence either.
Exactly. Voice and tense do not dictate each other. You can easily write a past tense active sentence like, I ate the cake. And you can write a future tense passive sentence like, the cake will be eaten.
Okay, the cake will be eaten is actually a great transition back to my movie camera analogy. That sentence leaves the actor totally out of the frame.
Yes, completely.
We don't know who is going to beat the cake. The source is called as the agentless or the short passive. This is where you just drop the by phrase entirely.
Right. So instead of saying the medication was administered by the nurse, you simply state the medication was administered, full stop. You sever the connection between the action and the person who did it.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources point out this is actually the most common form of passive voice in everyday use. And I know this firsthand. Because when I was a kid playing in the living room and I, knocked something over, I never ran to my mom and used active voice. I didn't say, I broke the lamp.
Of course not. That's a rookie mistake.
Right. I used the agentless passive. I said, Mom, the lamp was broken. It's basically a magic trick. The doer just evaporates.
Yeah, it completely removes accountability from the narrative. When the agent disappears, so does the blame, which brings us right back to our opening example, right? Mistakes were made.
Yep.
The Nixon administration used it during Watergate, and then over a decade later, officials in the Reagan administration used the exact same phrasing during the Iran-Contra hearings. We're just looking at this impartially as historical rhetoric, but it's a very clear pattern.
You see it everywhere once you know what to look for. Think about every corporate PR email you've ever received after a data hack.
No, absolutely. Customer data was accessed.
Or an error was made in your billing. They acknowledge the event happened, but they never name the actual human being or the specific department that messed up. And they often pair it with nominalization, turning the verbs into nouns. So instead of the CEO decided to lay people off, it becomes a decision was made regarding staffing.
The contrast is honestly jarring if you force those statements back into the active voice. Just imagine a press release that says, we made mistakes, or our security team allowed someone to access your data.
Wow. Yeah.
The grammatical structure is doing immense heavy lifting to protect the entity speaking.
So wait, if the tool is so perfectly designed to hide the truth, is passive voice just inherently deceptive? Is it always just a sneaky rhetorical trick to dodge blame?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, no. Evasion is simply a misuse of a neutral tool, because you can be just as evasive using the active voice.
Really? Let me think about that. How do you hide the doer while still using active voice?
By choosing a non-human subject. Think of the phrase, errors occurred.
Oh, I see.
That is structurally active. The subject is errors, and the verb is occurred. The errors did the occurring. But it tells you absolutely nothing about who caused the errors. The grammatical structure isn't the problem there. The intent of the writer to obscure the facts is the problem.
Okay, that makes sense. But because of these high-profile political and corporate evasions, the passive voice developed this terrible reputation. Like, for most of the 20th century, it was treated as the ultimate sin of writing.
Oh, yeah. English teachers acted like it was a disease you had to completely eradicate from your essays.
And our sources trace that crusade back to two massive historical authorities, right?
Yes. William Strunk Jr. and E.B. White, who published the incredibly influential book, The Elements of Style. Rule 14 in that guide is just this blunt directive, use the active voice. They argued it makes writing more vigorous and direct.
And the second authority is George Orwell. In his famous 1946 essay, Politics and the English Language, Orwell went after the passive voice hard.
He really did.
He had just lived through World War II and the rise of totalitarian propaganda, so he was highly sensitive to how language could, defend the indefensible. He argued writers were using passive constructions as a crutch to avoid taking a stand or naming names.
And Orwell was reacting to a very real phenomenon in the mid-century bureaucracy. But the crusade against the passive voice contains this astonishing twist.
Oh, the 2009 paper.
Yeah. In 2009, a linguist named Jeffrey Pullum published a meticulous takedown titled 50 Years of Stupid Grammar Advice.
Tell me about this. He analyzed Orwell's anti-passive essay and Strunk and White's book, right? What did he find?
Through rigorous text analysis, Pullum proved that Orwell and Strunk both use the passive voice frequently in the very texts where they condemned it.
You're kidding.
No, roughly 20% of the sentences in Orwell's essay contained passive constructions.
Wait, that is incredibly hypocritical.
Yeah.
The two most famous stylistic authorities of the century are preaching never use passive voice to millions of writers while just freely relying on it themselves.
The cognitive dissonance goes even deeper, honestly. Pullum pointed out that in The Elements of Style, Strunk and White provided explicit examples of what they considered bad passive sentences.
Okay.
And one of their textbook examples of a bad passive sentence was, there were a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground.
Okay, let's test that sentence. We are looking for the structural formula. The verb to be plus a past participle of a transitive verb.
Right, let's break it down.
So, there were a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground. Well, were is a form of to be.
Yeah.
But dead is an adjective. Leaves is a noun. Lying is a present participle. And like we talked about, you can't lie a leaf, so it's intransitive anyway.
Exactly.
There is no past participle here.
There is no passive verb in that sentence whatsoever. It is an existential there is construction combined with the participial phrase. The architects of the defining stylistic rule of the 20th century could not reliably identify a passive sentence when they wrote one down themselves.
That is wild. The people who built the rule book didn't even understand the architecture of the rule. Nope.
And what is maddening is that this failure persists today in our technology. Like, our sources highlight that modern grammar checkers, Microsoft Word, Grammarly, they still fail the passive voice test constantly.
Yeah, because software algorithms often rely on superficial pattern matching rather than deep structural logic. They look for a form of to be followed by a word ending in ed.
So I hate you.
They will wrongly flag a sentence like, I was tired, or this situation is complicated, as passive voice, completely missing that tired and complicated are functioning as adjectives in those contexts. They're describing a state of being, not an action being received.
Well, if the people who wrote the rule book were getting it wrong, and our modern billion-dollar AI grammar software is still getting it wrong, what hope do we have? Does this mean the avoid passive rule is just garbage?
Basically, yes. If we throw out the blanket never use passive rule, we have to look at the descriptive reality of the English language.
Right. So when is the passive voice actually the right choice for a writer? The sources outline 3 everyday scenarios where passive voice is standard, correct, and honestly stylistically superior. First, when the agent is unknown.
Okay, give me an example.
If you look out your window and your vehicle is missing, you say, my car was stolen. You cannot use the active voice because you don't know who took it. Saying, an unknown individual stole my car is just clunky and unnatural.
Yeah, nobody talks like that. The passive perfectly reflects your reality in that moment.
Exactly. Second is when the agent is just completely unimportant to the context.
Right. Like if I am talking about infrastructure, I say, the bridge was built in 1932. Nobody cares which specific construction firm poured the concrete. The fact of the bridge's existence is the point.
Right. And the third scenario is vital for journalism, which is victim-centered reporting. If a news outlet writes the victim was assaulted, they are making a deliberate stylistic choice to keep the reader's focus on the affected party.
That makes total sense. Forcing that into active voice like an assailant assaulted the victim shifts the empathy and the focus away from the victim and onto a faceless attacker.
It really is like the spotlight on a stage. If the bridge or the crime victim is the star of the show, you shine the spotlight right on them by making them the grammatical subject.
And that spotlight effect actively shapes how we process facts in professional fields too, especially in law and science.
Oh, absolutely. Legal scholar Joseph Kimball, who is a major advocate for plain language in law, he points out that passive voice is often much clearer for legal obligations.
How so?
Well, a regulation that reads, "The form must be filed within 30 days," keeps the spotlight entirely on the requirement itself. The person reading the regulation only cares about what needs to be done, not the abstract authority commanding it.
But science is where this gets really fascinating to me, because the sources detail a massive pendulum swing in scientific conventions.
Yeah.
Like for most of the 20th century, scientists were essentially banned from using active voice in their research papers.
Yes. The prevailing philosophy of science at the time demanded the view from nowhere.
The view from nowhere.
Right. Researchers were supposed to be completely impartial observers, almost as if the science was just conducting itself. So writing, "The samples were centrifuged at 3,000 RPM, removed the human ego. It made the procedure sound objective and universally repeatable."
So naming yourself by writing, "I centrifuged the samples," felt like bragging or injecting personal bias into natural facts.
Exactly. But then in the 1980s and 90s, the major style guides completely reversed course. The American Medical Association and eventually the APA publication manual started pushing scientists to use active voice.
So why the massive shift?
It came down to methodological transparency. As scientific research became more complex, the scientific community realized that who did the action and how they did it fundamentally mattered.
That makes sense. If a paper says the data was adjusted, other scientists really need to know who adjusted and why.
Exactly. Moving to active voice, we adjusted the data based on this specific variable, forces the researchers to take direct ownership of their methodology. It leaves no room to hide behind the agentless passive if an experiment fails to replicate.
That tension between transparency and self-preservation isn't just an academic debate, though. It actually has life or death consequences when you bring it into a hospital setting.
What's fascinating here is how delicate that balance is. And for the nursing students listening, this is exactly why voice is heavily tested on the TEAS and HESI A2 exams.
Because clinical documentation is basically a linguistic tightrope. On one hand, nursing charting conventions are highly patient-centered, which naturally lends itself to the passive voice. The patient was found unresponsive on the floor. The wound was dressed. The patient is the subject of the record.
But on the other hand, nurses are navigating immense legal cautiousness. If you use the agentless passive and write "vitals were not checked," you are shielding yourself from writing "I failed to check the vitals."
Wow, yeah. It's the clinical version of mistakes were made.
And in a malpractice lawsuit, a lawyer will tear that ambiguity apart. Accurate documentation is a patient safety issue. If a chart note obscures who performed an action or who failed to perform it, the next shift of nurses might make a critical medical error based on that missing information.
So healthcare professionals have to purposefully move between the scientific objectivity of the passive voice and the strict accountability of the active voice.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean practically? Let's make this highly practical for our listeners preparing for their exams tomorrow.
Right.
Let's say I am staring at a multiple-choice question on the TEAS test. The question asks me to identify the passive sentence or to convert a passive sentence into an active one. Walk me through the logical steps to solve it.
Okay, first, ignore your instincts about past tense words like was. Run the structural test. Find the verb phrase and look for a form of be plus a past participle. If it's there, you have a passive sentence.
Okay, so I find a sentence that says the diagnosis was confirmed. I see was, which is my be verb, and confirmed, the past participle. So it's passive. Now the test asks me to convert it to active voice.
To convert it, you must locate the true doer of the action and move them to the subject position. But in your example, the diagnosis was confirmed. It's an agentless passive. The doer is missing entirely.
Right, there is no by the doctor.
In that case, you have to look at the multiple choice options and logically supply the missing agent. The correct answer will be the one that puts a logical doer in the subject slot.
Okay.
So the diagnosis was confirmed becomes the physician confirmed the diagnosis. The physician is now the subject, actively performing the confirmation. Unlocking the right answer always comes down to asking who actually does the action.
It is brilliant how a seemingly dry grammar rule dictates so much of our reality. I mean, whether you are a nurse writing a chart note at 3 a.m., a public relations rep managing a data breach, or just a student trying to write a clearer essay, mastering the active and passive voice gives you control over the narrative.
It really does.
You get to decide who is in the frame. You get to decide who gets the credit and who gets the blame.
And, as we rely more on technology, this raises a crucial question about the future of communication. AI and algorithms are increasingly drafting our emails, our corporate press releases, and even our initial medical chart notes.
Yeah, that's true.
We really have to wonder what grammatical logic is being hardwired into those systems. Will artificial intelligence be programmed to default to the active voice, promoting radical transparency and accountability? Or, when an algorithm inevitably causes a system failure, will it naturally gravitate toward the agentless passive, cleanly removing its corporate creators from the narrative by simply stating, errors were made?
That is a chilling thought. If the machine breaks, will it admit who broke it or just quietly pan the camera away? Well, you've given us so much to think about today. Thank you all for joining this deep dive. Keep questioning the information you consume. Always look for the hidden actor. And please, don't let anyone convince you the passive voice is just a simple mistake. We'll see you next time.